Now I have the pleasure to introduce Uta Heil, who is one of the organizers of these meetings. She's professor at the Protestant Theological Faculty of the University of Vienna. She belongs to the Athanasius Berke group, the group led by Professor Brennecke, here, who is present here with us, that has edited the Dokumente zur Geschichte des Arianischen Streites, which is a key work in this area. Currently, Uta is working on a project on the Apocryphal Sunday in late antiquity and early Middle Ages, and on another about the Exposiciones in Salmos of Pseudo-Athanasius. We are happy to welcome Uta Heil to discuss one of the key texts describing the outbreak of the so-called Arian crisis. Thank you, Uta. The floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you for the introduction, and yeah, thank you for joining us and starting the rediscussion of the debate of the Arian crisis. And yeah, and we thought it would be nice to start the Arian debate with a debate about debates in itself. And I want to share my screen. Just a second. There. The short introduction. The Aryan Controversy is, in short, an inner Christian dispute about how to unite monotheism with the confession of Christ and later also of the Holy Spirit as God, and characterized the entire 4th century. This conflict began in Alexandria and was at first confined to the Greek East, and over time, and especially through exiling of those it denounced, it was carried to the West as well. In criticism of Alexander, the Bishop of Alexandria, who advocated the equality of the Logos with God, the Alexandrian presbyter Arius placed the transcendence and sole divinity of the Father fully in the foreground. For him, God alone, the Father, is uncreated, unbegotten, and eternal. Using terminology of a negative theology, Arius emphasizes the unity and transcendence of God as the creator of all earthly things. Thus, he rejects the co-eternity of the Logos with God, because otherwise God's absolute uniqueness would be annulled. God alone is without beginning. Besides the question of monotheism, the question of the origin or begetting of the Son from the Father proves controversial. Arius insists that before all time, the Father brought the Son into existence out of nothing. Taking up Proverbs 8:22, he can say also that the Son was created besides begotten. Thus, Christ as the Word of God, the Logos, belongs for Arius entirely to the side of the divine, but is clearly subordinate to God. Arius is therefore a representative of the Logos theology. On the one hand, he opposes a theology that was widespread in Egypt and Libya, which in principle identified God the Father and the Son with each other, because this would dismiss the transcendence and unity of God. On the other hand, with his radical emphasis on God as creator, he opposes also Manichaeism. The Son did not emerge from God's essence in such a way that he is part of God's essence or an outflow emanation of God. However, it is not the place here to elaborate the whole dogmatic debate. And we are not here to discuss the details of chronology and dating, which has been debated many times over and over again. My focus is here on a passage from the church history of Sozomenes you have here on the slide. As is known, all church histories, thus also Socrates and Theodoretus, report about the beginning of the dispute in Alexandria, but only Sozomenos includes this passage, which is without parallel, therefore. Looking at this passage, it seems that there were attempts at the beginning in Alexandria to resolve this theological controversy by way of a public disputation. According to Sozomenos, the condemnation of Arius was preceded by even 2 disputations. But let's look at the text. What can we read in Sozomenos? At first, the report starts with a note on the high reputation of Arius in Alexandria. In concrete, he was also respected by Alexander, since, quote, he was a most expert logician. However, and this is now a typical short anti-heretical portrait of Arianism or the errors of Arius, he fell into absurd discourses. 4 topics, short topics are then mentioned, which have large similarity to the condemnations of Nicaea. These topics, presented then by him in sermons and promoted in conversations and argumentations or investigations, then caused unrest. And it was brought to Alexander, the bishop, to do something about it. As Sozomenos relates, those who heard these doctrines advanced blamed Alexander for not opposing the innovations at variance with doctrine. Alexander, however, preferred to settle the differences by way of a public open dispute. One can read, but this bishop deemed it more advisable to leave each party to the free discussion of doubtful topics, so that by persuasion rather than by force, they might cease from contention. Hence, he sat down as a judge with some of his clergy and led both sides into a discussion. Obviously, Alexander did not want to intervene directly by episcopal order or authority, but to take up the matter by disputation and also to end it by disputation. However, he himself has taken the right to preside over this event as a judge. According to the logic of this report in Sozomenos, the reason was that Arius had actually presented new theses so that there is no former decision as precedent to fall back on. Of course, according to our today's insight into the debate, Arius stood in good Alexandrian Platonic tradition of Logos theology and just did not present radical innovations at all. But this is only a short remark. From the way Sozomenos reports the events, it becomes apparent that he himself does not quite agree with this development, especially with Alexander's behavior as a bishop. In addition, it is interesting to read that there were 2 sides, one led by Arius, and the other side actually remains in the background. For Sozomenos, these are apparently simply all Orthodox. Therefore, it is not necessary to name them in more detail. Only heretics are mentioned by name. However, the Bishop Alexander also does not set the line, but acts as an arbiter. Whoever apparently argues better gets the nod. The critical distance of Sozomenos is obvious. He would prefer Alexander to decide the matter authoritatively as a bishop and not wait for a debate to take place. This critical tone can also be read from the next sentence. Quote, but it happened on this occasion, as is generally the case in strife of words, that each party claimed the victory. Arius defended his assertions, but the others contended that the Son is consubstantial and co-eternal with the Father. Quote end. Sozomenos apparently considers such debates superfluous or not useful, since they prolong the dispute and do not bring about a solution. Neither side gives in. Everyone declares himself the winner. The debate thus had the opposite effect of what Alexander wanted to achieve. The quarrels did not stop, but started all over again. As evidence, Sozomenos then pointed out that they even had to meet a second time. But even then, the debate was inconclusive. Quote, The Sanhedrin meeting was convened a second time, and the same points contested, but they came to no agreement among themselves. During the debate, Alexander seemed first to incline first to one party and then to the other, quote end. This wavering of Alexander also does not go down well with Sozomenos, but eventually he is able to report that Alexander has made a decision. Quote, finally, however, he declared himself in favor of those who affirmed that the Son was consubstantial and co-eternal with the Father, and he condemned Arius to receive this doctrine and to reject his former opinions. Thus, apparently, the result of the debate is narrowly reported. Alexander, as judge, decided against Arius. Once again, it is regrettable that the side of those who debated against Arius remains unnamed. According to Sozomenos' account, it was not Alexander who declares one side the winner. Only at the end of the second act of the disputation he did it. It would be interesting to know who had taken the floor against Arius first. Arius and his followers, however, refused to abandon their views and accept the decision of the assembly led by Alexander. So now, after Arius and his followers refused to accept the result of the disputation, a second step is taken. Alexander expels Arius from the church. The presbyter is condemned. It is this excommunication that will finally carry the dispute beyond the borders of Alexandria and Egypt, because many then joined Arius after all and considered his condemnation as not justified. How is this chapter from the church history of Sozomenos to be judged? Unfortunately, as I said, there is no other witness to these events. They cannot be confirmed either by the other church histories or by the surviving early letters. Not even from the two famous letters of Alexander it emerged. And the well-known theological declaration of Arius, which he and a few of his supporters had written and delivered to Alexander, does not mention this. Of course, this declaration could well be interpreted as a basis for discussion opening a disputation, or this theological statement could also be well understood as a summarizing, concluding statement of Arius to be placed either between the two disputations or also following the debates, since it became clear that Arius was not ready to distance himself from his convictions. In addition, another problem, of course, is that Sozomenos is only relating here and not citing a document. So at best, we have a regest. On the other hand, as I hope became clear from my presentation, Sozomenos here refers to a report or from a source that describes something for him that he himself actually criticizes. So after all, the tendency of what is reported contradicts his own intention, which supports the observation that Sozomenos actually seems to be incorporating a source here, not following his own creative inventiveness. I stop this because I continue not discussing the source anymore. So how to deal with this passage? Apart from his precise analysis of the text itself in a search for possible sources, there remains, of course, the possibility to ask for a general historical plausibility of what is reported. What kind of event is this supposed to have been? Is it within the realm of possibility? What Sozomenos reports here is a public disputation, even if details are unfortunately only touched upon. These are special events that have demonstrably existed in the history of Christianity since the 2nd century. I mean, an arranged public event before an audience, the cause and outcome of which can be recorded, in which two or more opponents engage in a dispute with the aim of convincing the other of his position, which could succeed or fail. with the participation of listeners as witnesses and usually also someone acting as a judge. Such public debates were undoubtedly extraordinary events, a publicly held dispute about the nature of the divine or about worldviews as a mass media event. Here, the Greek culture of competition, which flourished anew, especially in the second sophistic, was adopted and then applied and further developed in disputes about Jewish traditions, pagan philosophy, and Christian heresy, so that debates went hand in hand with the formation of Christian doctrine and could serve to resolve conflicts in a theological controversy. Therefore, it was not only about a playfully achieved victory in an intellectual duel, but also about establishment and enforcement of a conviction and of a truth. However, compared to synods, it is obvious that by no means every discussion or every disputation at a synod is to be regarded as a disputation, nor is every disputation at the same time a synod, although at a synod, a disputation between two or more opponents could be scheduled separately. On the synodal level, however, negotiations only took place if there was still a possibility for ecclesiastical community. With pagans, Jewish, or later especially Manichaeans opponents, disputes were conducted outside a synod, as far as can be proven. Evidence exists of debates that took place, as well as published minutes or transcripts of debates. Of course, it must be borne in mind that such transcripts were mostly published by the victorious side, in which their own superiority is one-sidedly brought to the fore, thus offering a polished and one-sided version of a more complex communication event. This fact also applies to the presentation of the dispute between Photinus and Basil in Sirmium in 351 by Epiphanius of Salamis. In addition, there are many literary staged disputes, either as reconstructions or even as purely fictional events. This literature sometimes takes up real debates, putting them in a narrative form and recalling them to memory. For example, Augustine's disputation with Pascentius in the so-called Collatio Augustinicum Pascentio. Interesting, some surviving debates also contain reflections on what constitutes a successful debate and what mistakes should be avoided. Taken together, they result in a kind of ethic of debate, but at the same time point out that these standards were also not observed. However, it must be taken into account that there was no official legal regulation for such, nor has a theoretical treatise on debates survived. An outstanding disputant, for example, was, of course, Origen. In Athens, he held disputations with Candidus. In Bostra, he disputed several times with Bishop Beryl on the pre-existence of Christ. A papyrus from Tura offers an edited transcript of a disputation between Origen and Heraclides on the soul. And Contra Celsum 145, there he mentions a discussion with recognized Jewish scholars before a large audience, which was assembled in part to pass judgment on the dispute. Eusebius further reports a synod at Antioch in 268 that condemned Paul of Samosata as a heretic. Apparently, decisive for the verdict was a separately scheduled disputation between a Christian scholar named Malchion and this Paul, which was taken down by quick scribers and fair copies transcript was made. And Dionysius of Alexandria also engaged himself in a public disputation for 3 days about Chiliasm, which one can read in Eusebius. It seems to me that the short report as Zozomenos means exactly the same thing. Of course, this does not mean that Zozomenos actually reports something historical here. It could also be a legendary story. since the Arians are known to be adept dialecticians. This continues in accounts of Aetius, who also acted as a disputant, primarily refuting the Manichaeans. This has led to the fact that there are plenty of dialogues and even dialogue novels in which Arius or Arians appear and are refuted. Let me just mention among pseudo-Athanasian writings, the Disputatio contra Arium, or the dialogue between Athanasius and Zachäus. Many of these texts, however, are designed more like a Platonic dialogue than a public disputation. Here, the genres are quite blurred. Before I bore you with a long list here, let me return to Sozomenes, who himself also includes in his account of the Synod of Nicaea 2 additional legendary disputes between Christians and pagan philosophers. 3 chapters later, in Book 1, Chapter 18, he writes that pagan philosophers wanted to confuse Christians in their beliefs. Once, however, the simple old man stood up then and immediately converted a philosopher. Another time, Alexander of Constantinople silenced a group of philosophers in the literal sense. They were paralyzed and had to remain silent. So they could no longer raise their voices against the Christians. All this is reported by Sozomenes before he begins his actual report on the Synod of Nicaea. Here we are dealing with legendary disputes as they are to be found also in hagiography, for example, in the Vita Antonii or in the Pseudo-Clementines or in the Acts of Sylvester. Similar narratives are also encountered in the ecclesiastical history of Gelasius and in the ecclesiastical history of the Anonymous of Cyzicus. Here it is even the case that the Arians brought philosophers by themselves and paid them to support them in the debates. So it is here a philosopher who presented and defended the Arian core thesis. Ultimately, the arrogant, argumentative philosopher is again refuted and converted by the simple testimony of a confessor. This is also what one can read in Rufinus and in Socrates. All these texts are very well discussed by Richard Lim in his book, Public Disputations. But back to Sozomenes and my first source text. These disputations I just mentioned, which are associated with the Synod of Nicaea, have a different, much more legendary character than the passage from Sozomenes presented here at the beginning, for the beginning of the Aryan Controversy in Alexandria. This is not a narrative that contrasts the quarrelsome Arius with others who are better qualified rhetorically, as well as theologically or morally. Rather, the role of Alexander is sketched in a bit negative way. This supports the above assessment that Sozomenes is indeed incorporating here something into his account from an unknown source that could be credited as a regest. It is obvious that Sozomenes also includes such disputations in his church history and appreciates them positively. He is not fundamentally negative, but rather does not quite agree with the way they were carried out in Alexandria by Alexander. So there existed, besides synods, pamphlets, letters, sermons, and so on, also the possibility of a public disputation in case of a theological or philosophical or interreligious difference. At the beginning of the Aryan Controversy, this disputation had apparently also taken place in Alexandria. It is historically plausible what Sozomenes reports, although of course it cannot be asserted with certainty because of the singularity of the source and the form of a regest. In sum, I hope to be able to open the discussion with this example and at the same time to point ahead to further such disputations like the one between Photinus of Sirmium and Basil of Ancyra. And at the same time, I wanted to point to the importance of sources like the church histories like Sozomenes, and thus to the intended last topic in our seminar series, historiography, which Samuel mentioned already. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Yes, we thank you for this very interesting presentation in this short but very important key text of the historiography of the Aryan crisis. Now I have the pleasure to introduce you to Mayestina Kalos. She is Senior Research Fellow of the Reason and Religious Recognition Center of Excellence at the Academy of Finland and the Faculty of Theology at the University of Helsinki. Now he's at Cambridge as a visiting fellow. Currently, she is working in a project, Alienation, Adaptation, Accommodation, Imperial and Ecclesiastical Discourses of Control and Religious Dissenters in the Late Roman Empire. Recently, she published a very relevant book for our topic, that is Religious Dissent in Late Antiquity by Oxford University Press. Thank you, Majestina, for accepting our invitation, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me to comment Uta's paper. I hope you can hear me well. I find it as a very good idea to take one specific passage in a source text to be examined and discussed. And this Sozomen's account of the beginning of the Arian dispute in Alexandria. And Uta's paper is very fascinating. It opens up the issue of public disputation and debating culture in early Christianity. And I find the approach and search for the background for the public disputations and debating culture as plausible and possible. And just let me add a few thoughts and maybe like thoughts and questions that your paper inspired me to consider. I think it's like 7 short points. First, logic versus simplicity. As you mentioned, Sozomen gives a typical anti-heretical portrait, building upon the contrast between the snares of logic versus Christian simplicity, which we can, of course, compare this to the Platonic imagery of sophists and the true philosophers. And then the similar scheme is repeated in these 2 additional accounts of Sozomen's that you mentioned, this simple man who stood up against the Aryans and etc., etc. So that was one point. Then another interesting feature which comes forth here is the contrast between the innovations allegedly made by Arius and the doctrine allegedly being old and original. And I quote Sozomen, "Those who heard these doctrines advanced blamed Alexander for not opposing the innovations at variance with the doctrine," end quote. And as Uta points out, Sozomen's claim that Arius brought forth something new is not so straightforwardly correct. Arius's ideas were profoundly embedded or rooted in the Alexandrian Platonic Logos tradition. But the claim that the opponent is introducing new ideas and is deviating from the age-old honored tradition is a very strong argument in an environment, in an ancient environment that appreciated and revered traditions. So in ancient thought, the innovation is mostly negative. So that's a very strong argument to make and how to label the opponent. And therefore, it was frequently used as a rhetorical device. And Sozomen clearly here follows the line, and or perhaps the source takes this from the source he uses as if there is this source, as Uta suggests. So then third, the debating culture. And this is interesting. I quote Sozomen, but this bishop deemed it more advisable to leave each party to the free discussion of doubtful topics, so that by persuasion rather than by force they might cease from contention. Hence he sat down as a judge with some of his clergy and led both sides into discussion. End quote. So Bishop Alexander uses the strategy in which he lets the disputing partners to ponder the problems in free discussion. So it seems that Bishop Alexander has perhaps in his mind some kind of idea of negotiation, an attempt to negotiate between the disputing parties, and finally, like during this process, to find together a solution, which is a very idealistic vision indeed. And in the modern world, the philosopher Jürgen Habermas has enhanced this ideal, the force of the better argument. But as Ute shows, public disputations also had a role in the early Christian communities and their debating culture. So we have something similar. Maybe there were differences, but something in common, that there is this idea that debates and the idea that logic dialectics could lead to some kind of result. And this, of course, is connected to and rooted in the Greek agonistic debating culture, as Ute shows. Then there was this by persuasion rather than by force, which interestingly reminds of the Christian apologetic literature, in which some of the writers appealed to the persuasion and voluntary nature of religion instead of force and compulsion. And even Athanasius of Alexandria appealed to this, or defended this idea of persuasion later on. So this idea of persuasion versus force is also like in this culture, or is present there. And then assessing leadership is an interesting point here. That this Bishop Alexander tries to get his people to negotiate, but Sozomen does not appreciate this strategy. So one can ask here, is Sozomen assessing the bishop's leadership? So is Alexander, in Sozomen's view, a bad or incompetent leader? Is Sozomen blaming Alexander for bad leadership? And should the leader, in Sozomen's view, just have made the decisions in a manner of a monarch or monarch bishop, and never asked anybody else's opinion, or no negotiations, etc.? And in Sozomen's account, the result is that Alexander's wavering, actually, as Sozomen depicts it, leads into a greater trouble and confusion and strife. So, and then one could ask what kind of image is represented elsewhere of Bishop Alexander, and it would be interesting to compare the negative and positive images depicted of him. Yeah, that's a suggestion here. And then naming the heretic is also a very interesting point. it's interesting, as Uta shows, that Sozomen mentions Arius and those on his side by name, so listing them, and those on the other side are not named, and they are just mentioned simply that those who are on the right side. So is this another way of giving the impression that Arius and his side are just these mentioned guys, these names that could be like counted like fingers, and then the right-minded side is the majority. So like they are like everybody else. So one really might, and furthermore, one might also give a thought to that the lines were not this simple and clear on the two sides, but that there were other opinions. But this is how Sozomen depicts it. And then the idea of public disputation is really, I mean, and you also showed the background and earlier public disputations very well. So this makes this idea very plausible. My questions are just that how big these audiences were, what was the audience, who were in the audience, and then you say mass media events. Yeah, yeah, but that were the ideas and questions I had in mind. Thanks.
So thank you very much. Now we can open our discussion. Maybe we thank you, first of all, Majestina, for these clues, because also this shows the importance of interdisciplinary studies. We link together the same sources, but studying by different perspectives are very productive and very fruitful. Now we are going to start a discussion, but maybe first of all, Uta, do you want to say something?
No. Thank you for your comments, and I agree with your remarks. They support my topic, and yeah, you asked for the big audience. It's of course hard to give a concrete answer to it. It's not possible, and it's completely different. And I have here in mind the last other example I mentioned, Dionysius of Alexandria, which is perhaps something like an ideal, because in the report on it, it's quoted by Eusebius in his church history, and there he describes his engagement with the Chiliasm and the disputes about it, and that it was a 3 days disputation with arguments pro and fro, and nobody went angry, there was no disturbance. So we have there something like a description of an ideal of a disputation, and this perhaps set the line for perhaps Alexander, in remembrance of how Dionysius, so if is that to be taken historically, then perhaps Dionysius is the ideal, or this description of his engagement in Libya and so. And but even here, it's difficult to estimate. So it's not just like the bishop and the other one, and 2 and 3 audiences, and then the recording, those who recorded. It's more like a public event. Of course, we have then in later times, if we look at Augustine in his disputations with the Donatists, we have in the Therme, so we have the public bath. It's a huge event where the 2 sides even almost 2 times 300, and then you have to add the audience. So this was, I think, something like the biggest event we have records of, but others were probably more small. But it's hard to estimate here. And an additional remark, so you also supported that, well, there were two groups and only Arius is mentioned, Arius and his followers. And it would be very nice to see, well, if Alexander is the dad, who is debating with Arius actually? So, well, we switch later on to Epiphanius. Epiphanius says that, relates that it was Meletius who accused Arius to his bishop Alexander. So with some fantasy, one could perhaps put Meletius and Arius, but this is of course wholly a speculative possibility.
Thank you. Now then, we have the possibility, Professor Brennecke, please, and then Mark Delcogliano.
Yes, I think the view of Sozomenos is not so clear, because in paragraph 5, Synhedrio de Mapalin Genomenu, is the second disputation in paragraph 5, and this disputation can excommunicate Arius and his friends. This is a synod. But he doesn't say nothing about a synod. He's a synhedrion, but it is a synod because Arius was excommunicated and his followers.
Thank you.
Yeah. I think it's not so easy to decide, and it may be, but it's only a guess. So perhaps we have also a very condensed description of what was going on, and perhaps then this turned over or changed into a synod or a condemnation. So yeah.
Okay, thank you. And then Mark Delcogliano.
Hi. So I was so interested in the question of the unknown source, and I want to kind of float a theory, and that I just kind of thought of over the past couple of days and haven't investigated it, but I'm curious to see what you think about it. So if you look at the names of the other heretics, which are listed in section 15:7, Aethlos, Achilles, Carpontes, and the rest, those same names appear in Arius' letter to Alexander, right? And they're in the same order. There are some slight differences, but they're basically the same list there. And to me, that indicates that Sosimanth had that letter in his possession, right? And so I wonder, is he using that letter and the contents of that letter to extrapolate a public disputation in the manner that you've outlined, you know, based on how things were done? So is it a combination of the letter that we have and some other and in Sosimanth's own imagination based on how things were done that accounts for this report here? And do we need to deposit an unknown source? That's just a question I have.
Yeah, thank you. Of course, it's very striking that it's the same list or almost the same list of names. And we have this in the letter of Alexander as well. So this is like a typical list of the Arians, the followers of Arius. Yeah, well, I suggested that perhaps this letter of Arius, Urkunde 6 or our document 1, would fit well within this context of these disputations. And perhaps we have here a source where this letter is included with further references of where it was written for, or which was the purpose or the historical situation of this letter. And perhaps this is something then which Sozomenos had at hand, because just only reading the letter, then you have to use much fantasy to come to these public disputations. And of course, this could be combined with a synod, but you have then this extra event like a stage disputation and with two groups debating pro and fro. And but only from reading this well famous letter of Arius, I think it's hard to come to the conclusion what Sozomenos relates. But I think the historical situation suits very well why Arius wrote this letter, and it could fit very well within the context, either in between these two or afterwards, or as a like a prepared thesis or something like this for this disputation.
Thank you. We have Xavier Morales and then Anna Usacheva.
Thank you very much. I have 2 points. The first one is about the beginning of Sozomen's notice. As the actual edition of the GCS suggests, I think the notice is composed with various documents in mind. And I think, like Mark, that Sozomen has the letter, and for the central part of the notice, the list of names, etc., we can rely on this documentation. But for the first lines, if I well remind, there is a link with the Historia of the history of the Episcopate of Alexandria, that recently was discovered in Coptic, and we have various paraphrases in Greek. Lamentably, when Annick Martin, our colleague, published her book about Egypt in the 4th century, we did not have the Coptic version, so she had to deal with the paraphrases. But now we have the Coptic version, and the mixing of areas with militias seems to be a tactic of this history of the episcopate, which dates from the end of the 4th century. So it does not seem to be very reliable and credible. So the idea that Arius was first ordained as a deacon by Bishop I, then fell in heresy, then repented, and then was ordained a priest, etc., should be dismissed as a construct. The second point is a more general question. I was very interested in the debate as a genre, and at the genre as a genre outside the synod, and we shall see it anew in the debate between Basil and Fortinus. So my question would be, can we extrapolate from the debate to the way of proceeding of a discussion inside a synod, for example, at Nicaea, or should we consider the two way of deciding between 2 points of view, 2 very different proceedings? That's my question.
Thank you, Xavier.
I think we have to put this in separate, realms, because we have also disputations which were clearly not within a synod. But we have, while the synod is also developing and disputation is developing, and sometimes both features merge together, but sometimes not. And as I told you, with especially in later debates we have with the Manichaeans and so on, this is clearly not a synod. So we have both, but sometimes we have something like extra stage debates within a synod. So this would be my answer to your question. And I agree with your first remark, and this is actually the passage I skipped on my handout on the slides. And yeah, this is all, I think, too obviously just labeling areas with the problematic figures in Alexandria from the later perspective. And so that was a reason why I only very hesitantly suggested that perhaps malicious and Arius were the 2 combatants, but I'm not sure about this. And it's only, we have this only that malicious accuses Arius, it related in Epiphanius in his Panarion 69, this huge chapter. But yeah, you know all very well how problematic Epiphanius stories are.
Thank you. Now, Anna Usasheva, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Una, for your very thought-provoking and interesting presentation. So actually what I have is not a question, it's rather a remark. I was thinking about this debating culture and Gregory of Nazianzen and his first theological speech that of course also shows a little bit a little bit behind the scene of the debating culture of the time, because he also in the introduction addresses his opponents who are supposed to be in the audience, because he directly says that, and you are now, well, I mean, I'm paraphrasing of course, but he means that you are now who are making notes of my speech so that later on you will be able to write something against it. And probably, you know, paraphrase it in a better way, just as I'm doing right now. So, I mean, this is just pictures the scene that such a debate, if we ask the question whether it was possible, actually my reaction is, but it could hardly be helped to not have such a discussion, because, I mean, obviously, until another bishop is condemned or there's anathema proclaimed on him, how could you help but to have this discussion? And then of course it could be an open debate or such a kind of writing pamphlets against each other, which again we see in Basil of Caesarea writing against Eunomius, and then Gregor of Nyssa writing against. So I mean, it's back and forth. And another interesting thing that is that Gregor of Nazianzen in his first theological speech actually portrays his opponents exactly as sophists. So the whole sort of scene is created in a very similar way as you just presented it in your analysis. So I mean, of course we cannot check it up, but intuitively it really seems to be so. And moreover, that it has been followed then in the second stage of the debate in much of the same way. So yeah, that's just a remark. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think there are very different estimations about those debates. And we can see it here in Sozomenos, some very critical remarks. So some are very hesitant about it and are very reluctant to use this because it doesn't come to an end, or who is really able to give up his ideas and give in and to accept better argument and so on. So we have different authors. So if you look at someone at Tertullian or the Hippolytus, so there we have remarks, don't dispute anyway with any heretic. It doesn't make sense, and we argue about the same biblical verses, and doesn't help anything. So, or you can read comparable remarks, especially in Ambrose. He is very critical in this way, very contrary to Augustine, who is a very well debater. On obviously he knows how to succeed and isn't hesitant in going into debate. When he was Manichaean, he engaged in debates, winning people to Manichaeism, and when he was a Christian bishop, he was engaged in several public debates. And we have this controversy with the Donatists who criticize Augustine, just always debating against him, and they don't like to get into struggle with him. And so we have very different traditions within Christianity. We look at different authors, some very well, I think someone like Basil of Ankara, he is very well in going into on the stage and engage in this debate, but others are very reluctant. And so we have also then complaints about people misusing this debate. So, but interestingly, I think it is also the observation that even in hagiographic literature or something like the Pseudo-Clementines or some literature like this, we can see an effect of those events. And so where all those figures are staged as being competent even in this feature. Yeah, so I think it's we have these events, but not everybody within the of our bishops is very happy about it.
Thank you. I don't know if someone else. I have a question, but I don't want to use my position to get the word. But well, yeah, I will ask something. In the paragraph 5, we have in the last words are, during the debate, Alexander seemed to incline first to one party and then to the other. That is this, we know that is a retrospective account, presented Alexander as something like as a neutral umpire about the debate, because he's, well, inclining one like the judge of the debate. However, when we read the long letter of Alexander, it seems that Alexander has to defend his own theology. And then I wonder whether in this debate, Alexander's theology itself was called into question by Arius. And well, these remarks are framed in the relationship between the bishop and the school of theology, so to say. In the 3rd century, we have 2 poles in Alexandria. Then in the 4th century, we have only one. That is, the bishop attract many features that belong to the school of theology, to the so-called catechetical school. And then how do you see do you think that Alexander's theology was also called into question in this debate?
Well, that's the information we get from many sources, that Arius questions theological topoi of Alexander. And yeah, and here it is presented in a bit different way. So we have here Alexander not directly accused by Arius. So it's a bit, it's not easy to unite these. If it is true that this is a report about something right really at the beginning of the Arian debate, then perhaps it is possible to unite both versions, because Alexander, he then took side only within the beginning struggle. But it's not easy to find a plausible historical solution. Because, well, this is what I said, the problem is here the other side. It's only Arius presented, and we don't know who was the other, who were the other group, who built the other group. Well, within the perspective of the later view, like Sozomenus, as he relates, it's obviously the Catholic Church, the majority, something like this.
Thank you. Xavier Morales.
Yes, I'm very interested in this this question about knowing if really the end of the debate, the result of the debate was open. If really Alexander could have chosen the Arius side. And I want to recall another debate which has the same structure, that is a bishop convokes two groups, but actually he's part of one of the two, and it's about Dionysius and the affair in Ptolemais. We have the luck, we are lucky because we have a fragment of a letter of the very Dionysius of Alexandria reporting to Rome about the affair. And the description made by Dionysius is that there were two groups debating. The two groups sent voicers to Alexandria. The bishop received the two groups, and then he published what he calls not a judgment, but a pedagogy, something more pedagogical. The passage is difficult to understand, but he says, I did not have to take a part. I just cleared the confusion. But just before this description of the action of the proceedings, he begins saying that in Ptolemais there emerged a horrible blasphemy, a terrible heresy, and they are saying something absolutely false and heretical. So he is taking parts, and when I read this part, I compare it with Sozomen's way of presenting the things. That is, we make as if the bishop were a neutral judge, but in fact, he is one of the parts. I wanted to know how do you react to this parallel between the two situations?
Yeah, it is a quite suitable parallel, and well, it's a pity that Sozomenus is just so short. So it's all further ideas remain a bit speculative, but I think here it is really staged like an ideal debate, the bishop more as an organizer and giving both sides the possibility to argue. And I think especially because the tendency of Sozomenes is a bit with reservation and distance to these developments. I think it is all the more important that we still can see or detect this in these few sentences. And while you argued that is it plausible or possible that Alexander had at the beginning not an own opinion about Arius? Well, if we see this as an Alexandrian debate within the realms of Middle Platonism and the school of Origen, where both have to be united with, then it is in a way possible. So when we read the letters of Alexander, so he is not in the way like in the theological position like Marcellus or so. So there is a difference, and it could be in a way to see well this is two parallel heritages of Origen, and not parallel, but two people in the heritage of Origen, not so far away as from the later development it turned out to be. Perhaps it's a bit provocative, but I think it's not so far away to see both. And it's not only my opinion to see both in the tradition of Origen.
Thank you so much. Now we are going to give the word to Marta Elcoliano, and afterward also to I wish to give Mayestina the opportunity to react on all these topics. No? And then Mark, please.
So what I was going to say was just actually said by by Uta. So I think that's a very good point. So I think this kind of wavering of Alexander, but tilting one side to Arius, like in one side to the other side. So he's being depicted as almost himself being undecided, and being persuaded by the arguments of each side before finally choosing. And if you look at the early documents that are produced in this period, it's a pretty kind of clear-cut difference. You know, so Arius teaches this, and this is what the Orthodox teaching is, and they're diametrically opposed. And so if the teachings of Arius and the Orthodox are so clearly different, then why does Alexander waver so much? And I think you must be right that they are coming out of a similar theological background, and that the nuances of the debate have been lost maybe in the reporting of the debate, because it doesn't seem like it should be as close as it should have been. But rather they're much nearer to each other, like not so far apart. So now, of course, like we don't know if we don't know it like this is an actual historical event, but at least in the depiction of it, it suggests a much closer proximity in the theological views of those arguing in Alexandria in this time than a later historiography would admit. So I agree with you basically.
Thank you. And then I wish to give the word to Mayestina, and then some final words of this session by Uta.
Thanks. This was very interesting. interesting discussion, and we could have just ended with Mark's words about the nuances that probably were lost in the course of the debate when the debate just went on, and I'm just thinking of even like modern debates or modern controversies about so many different things that are just going on about gender and so on, that those disputants, they somehow get lost in those controversies and they cannot just negotiate anymore. And this is probably what happened like here. And you all know probably so much better that. But I wish just we would know more about the early phases of this debate. But what Uta has done is really interesting about this, the whole mapping out the debating culture and the public disputations. So I hope to hear more in the near future about your research.
Thank you. And then now Uta can give final words for this part of the session.
Well, I have the impression I have said enough. Yes, thank you very much for your comments, and yeah, it was also very helpful for me to really go through one short passage in one of the church histories we have, and I really for preparation I compared Sozomenos with Socrates and Theodoret and the other church histories we have, how they relate the beginning of the Aryan controversy. And so it's really that this presentation here on Sozomenos is outstanding and cannot be found in the other church histories. And so, well, I think this topic of public debate and debating culture, which sometimes happened at a synod or not, but this is an interesting additional feature to look at within all our controversies we have, and not just to look at, well, it's of course enough, but to look at the letters or the tractates we have or anything, but to look at this genre in itself. And yeah, but we will then move on to further such disputations or similar events, and I think it would be interesting. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, and thanks to everyone.